Welcome to another session of Life as an Entrepreneur and the Distinguished Innovator Lecture Series. I am pleased to be able to introduce today's speaker, Peter Fiske, who has a very interesting background, I think, for today's crowd, having both an MBA and a PhD education. In 2001, his plan for Rapt Industries won first place in the UC Berkeley Business Plan competition. He went on to lead Rapt as CEO until April of 2004, when he transitioned to the role of VP of Business Development. Earlier this year, he left Rapt to join Pact Scientific, where he works with two other Haas grads, Jason Oppenheimer and Trevor Dowden. He has a PhD in geological and environmental sciences from Stanford University and an MBA from Haas. Go Bears. As a scientist, he led the research group in the Physics and Advanced Technologies Directorate of the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. From 1998 to 1999, he served as a member of the laboratory's long-range strategy project, identifying critical technology areas for the laboratory's future. In this role, he was focused on technology spin-off and startup strategies for the laboratory. In 1996, Peter was awarded the White House Fellowship and served a 1 year in the Clinton administration as a special assistant to the Secretary of Defense for Special Projects. He's a nationally recognized lecturer on the subject of leadership and career development for young scientists and engineers, and author of 2 books, To Boldly Go, A Practical Career Guide for Scientists, and Put Your Science to Work. Let's give a warm welcome to Peter Fiske.
Thank you, Ted, and hello, everybody, and thank you for having me here tonight. I want to sort of just do a census of who is in the audience. For starters, how many of you are engineering undergrads? Engineering graduate students? Okay, MBAs? Undergraduate business degree? Anybody else I haven't mentioned? Law student? Ah, the law student! All right. Well, thanks for having me today. You know, the funny thing is when Ted, you sent me the email and asked me to be part of this session, I was flattered, but at the same time I thought I might be playing more a role of comic relief, because while you've had some extraordinary people talk to you so far this year, like Jerry Fiedler, I was happy to come, but I wanted to caution you that, yeah, I'm an entrepreneur, but I'm not rich, and I haven't IPO'd a company yet, or any of those great flashy things that a lot of people assume about entrepreneurship. But I have spent a lot of time as a person who started off life as a technologist and a scientist, thinking about this strange transition that I did. And so when I talk about this issue of entrepreneurship, I tend to get very personal, because entrepreneurship, while you all may be talking about it very much in economic terms or business terms, it also is a very personal career choice. And it's a choice that many of you are going to encounter in a way that I want to describe in a little bit more detail tonight. And so I thought that in the time we'd have together that I would talk to you about a little bit of my experience along the way, tell you a little bit about Rapt Industries, but also talk to you some about some of the hidden opportunities that you may not have considered as you sit there doing your MBA or doing your undergraduate degree in engineering or in business. So for me, a little bit about my background. I grew up in Bethesda, Maryland. My dad is a geologist and a scientist. And so I grew up with my whole life with science around me. And it was a wonderful world, this world of science. And for many of you who are engineers, you kind of know the feeling. In the science world, everything is orderly. And you know what you're supposed to do as a scientist, right? And you know the career path of a scientist. It's sort of like a life cycle, right? You go to college, then you go to grad school, then you do a postdoc, then you do a postdoc and a postdoc and a postdoc and a postdoc. Then you get an assistant professorship and tenured professorship, retirement, and death. It's all just so nice and simple, right? And so the funny thing is that ironically, while I really loved science and mostly loved what my dad was doing in his life, I was a very atypical science student. And I started to peek my head out from this sort of this dome, this nice orderly world of academia and science, and began to probe to see what existed out of there. And at first, it's a very kind of confusing and disorienting space. And with time, I gradually kind of got to know it a little bit better. And it was actually that journey out of science into what I'm doing now, which prompted me to write the books that I wrote, talking to scientists and engineers about this big transition of leaving academia and leaving the bench. But I must admit that if I look back now on my life and my activities, I probably should have seen some early signs of trouble, that this kid wasn't going to just be a good scientist and a good engineer. So here's some pieces of evidence, obviously. I liked Captain Kirk a lot more than I liked Mr. Spock, okay? In elementary school, I chose to go to drama camp over science camp. Bad indication there. My verbal SAT scores were 100 points higher than my quantitative. Actually, my PhD advisor said that at Stanford, they take a serious concern over graduate students in scientific fields who apply, who have higher verbal than quantitative GMAT or GREs. While I was an undergrad, I got very concerned that, geologists need to study the Earth. It's sort of like, reading about geology is like singing about football. It doesn't make much sense until you're out there actually, knocking on rocks. So I organized with another friend a big field trip for undergraduates in geology to the Southwest, and that was kind of my first opportunity to organize a big thing, and I found out that I enjoyed doing that. At Stanford, I was at Stanford from '88 to '93, and some of you may have remembered that we had a big earthquake out here in the Bay Area then, the Loma Prieta earthquake. Well, what happened on campus is a lot of buildings were damaged but not destroyed, and so there's a whole bunch of used furniture they want to get rid of. So I organized with another friend of mine this thing called the Sale of the Century, where we raffled off a whole bunch of antique Stanford furniture that they were going to throw away. And with that money, we founded the Stanford Alpine Project. And now that project continues taking graduate students at Stanford all around the country to look at geology. I was my advisor and I remain good friends. But he will probably, if he was here beside me, be nodding vigorously when I say that I was probably a bit of a problem graduate student. I tried to be diligent. I really tried to just focus on what I should, but I kept finding these other interesting things to do. And it wasn't just organizing the Stanford Alpine Project, it was things like this extracurricular research, which I glommed onto and did, much to the frustration of my advisor. Even if it did result in publications, it still was sort of definitely playing off the reservation. I did NMR spectroscopy for my PhD thesis at Stanford, and ended up having run over this laboratory and did a bunch of analyses for people at Lawrence Livermore Lab, again, much to the frustration of my advisor. But that led to my postdoc at Lawrence Livermore Lab and sort of launched my career. I then, in a postdoc, wrote a book on career development for scientists, and then laid a major push at Lawrence Livermore Lab for postdoc training. So by the time the White House Fellowship came along, pretty much the scientific community had given up on Peter Fiske. They knew that I was kind of off to do something else. And at the time, the funny thing is I never really had a very clear sense of what exactly was going to happen next. And I think this is something that certainly engineers, but also sometimes maybe MBAs find a little disconcerting, is that a lot of your career and what happens in your life is largely based on chance encounters and random opportunities and things that you can't specifically plan for, but you can just prepare for. And even setbacks are things that will happen to you throughout your life, but will then introduce a new set of opportunities if you choose to look at it that way. And so yeah, my advisor was a little concerned. I did get some good publications out. I wasn't, bad. I wasn't a bad graduate student, but I certainly wasn't the apple of his eye, the wonderful, productive scientist, professor that he was training all his other students to be. Well, this issue, this forum is called Life of the Entrepreneur, and entrepreneur is capitalized. But a while ago, I started thinking about this issue and kind of came to a conclusion that entrepreneurship, and certainly in business school, when we talk about entrepreneurship, we talk about that capital-y entrepreneurship, the starting a business, venture capital, IPOs, fame and fortune, BMWs, all that great stuff. And I certainly, I thought about it and thought that, there are really two issues here. Entrepreneurship, or an entrepreneur is a career, and somebody might call themselves an entrepreneur. But entrepreneurial is quality. And it's something a little bit more basic and also something that can be applied in a lot broader set of circumstances. And I think that one of the things that is important to understand is that you can lead an entrepreneurial life without necessarily following an entrepreneurial career. And in fact, I think sometimes you can have the biggest impact if you play an entrepreneurial role in a quote-unquote non-entrepreneurial setting, such as your company, or your child's school, or your community. And so I tend to think of entrepreneurship much more broadly, not about business per se, but about choosing personally to want to make a difference, to want to have an impact in the world around you. And the other thing is that as I made this big transition, what I thought was a big transition from the safety and security of Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory to this startup, Rapt Industries, a lot of people, when you look at that, you think, oh, all that risk. How did you do it, Peter? How did you cope with all that risk? And actually, if I thought about it, once I did it, the funny thing was the risk is sort of overrated. It's not really as risky as you think it is. And here's why. Here's some reasons. For starters, today, careers, technical and non-technical careers, are a lot more dynamic and unpredictable than you think. And you've got your parents and their experience, you've got professors and their experience, but your experience and the experience of your peers will be very different because things change now. We don't count on the same sort of social contract that our parents counted on with respect to an employer, or even with respect to a retirement system from the US government. Our generation are people who are growing up in an environment where you're expected to be much more self-reliant and sort of self-motivated. And the whole idea that a big company represents security and safety is also out. I mean, we've now watched for the last 25 years US industry go through tremendous upheavals of growth and then exhaling tens of thousands of employees. We watch companies like SAP and other companies be acquired and reorganized. And so you may sit there yearning for a degree of security in those large companies, but find out that size is no longer any guarantee of survival. In fact, something I certainly found at Lawrence Livermore Lab was your risk of being frustrated and unhappy are much higher the less control you have over your life professionally. And sometimes, especially for engineers, you can find yourself absolutely tearing your hair out because of boneheaded things that your management does that you feel powerless to change. The other aspect, I think, about life in general now is that your career mobility is largely under your own control. The degree to which you maintain a positive network of friends and professional colleagues, that you communicate to them your interests and abilities and your accomplishments, that really is the asset that you have moving forward in your life. And finally, your financial stability is largely under your own control. How you choose to spend your money, how much money you save, and how you prepare for periods of financial uncertainty versus periods of financial, quiet are, again, things under your control. And one of the great things about having been an undergraduate, and for those of you in graduate school, is that you've learned to live on $2,000 a month in the Bay Area. I mean, that's a huge skill that will come in, actually, sadly, very handy throughout your life. One friend of mine said that his definition of mental health was feeling that you had options. And I asked him, is that having options, Jeffrey, or feeling that you had options? Oh, no, just the feeling is all that matters. And so I think that in thinking about any choice professionally that you make, to leave a job or to stay, to embark on a new project or not to, largely feeling what other options you have is really very important to yourself, just to your kind of sanity. So, if you think about entrepreneurship with a capital E, you think of companies. But as I look at kind of what I care about and what I'm concerned about, here's what my vision is for what I'm doing now and where I want my career to go. I have three basic beliefs. One is that technology has enormous potential to improve the world, but if it's deployed in an economically meaningful way. One of the things that was very disconcerting to me about my life at Stanford was all the time and all the effort spent on activities that, if I really thought about it for a bit, weren't really going to have that much of an impact on people. And it was very satisfying. In some respects, the academic world can be very exciting, but I was always a person interested in other people and in what would happen. Academia is wonderful in a lot of ways. It's a great environment, and really, in many respects, the United States is the OPEC of higher education on the planet. But at the same time, academia is really bad at a couple very important things. First of all, in training students to think broadly about their careers. Now, engineering departments in general are better than science departments, and while most of you are undergraduates, you are being told that there's a broad world ahead of you. But for those of you who go on to graduate school, for those of you who are in graduate school now, you're already going to be feeling the walls sort of coming in and channeling you into a more and more narrow set of options. And in fact, for those of you who go on to PhD programs, you will find that no matter what your department says, ultimately the real focus as a graduate student is producing scholarly research, which is aiming mainly towards an academic market. The second thing that academia still doesn't do a very good job of is technology commercialization. And the irony is that there is so much great stuff that happens here that actually, when it comes right down to it, the stuff that actually gets commercialized and becomes a commercial success, that is to say, technologies that are deployed in an economically meaningful way, are more the exception than the rule. They're more the accident. And that's partly because of the inherent cultural and literal legal barriers that exist in academia. And also, it's a lot to do just with the way that people look at problems in academia versus the way people look at problems on the outside. And the problems that are posed in an academic environment versus the problems that are posed outside. And finally, my third tenet is that people, not patents or publications, are the vector for innovation. So when you see a new technology, if you look beneath the main story, you'll see that actually what got the technology out was not the publication in Science or Nature, but was in fact somebody's choice to leave academia and go start a company, or for a group of people to come together and create a company, or to leave a company to form another company. One of the funny things about invention and inventors is that when you look at inventions, there's some that are absolutely breathtaking in their ingenuity. But of course, the inventor was the person who thought of it, and they tend to not think that, it was as non-obvious as everybody else thinks it is. And so there's a funny paradox about inventors. And so inventors, if they've invented something, they already have a unique insight into how this thing works. And it's very hard for an inventor to stay, say, as a faculty member at UC Berkeley and sort of toss a bunch of ideas over the transom or through the tech transfer office on campus and hope that an outside set of investors are going to somehow bring together a core group of people able to take exactly that same mindset, replicate it on the outside, and get going. People have to be the key vector for that technology. And the reason I bring this up is that, in fact, the people who tend to be the most important vector for new technology are the people in this room. In fact, it's you. And I want to talk to you a little bit more about that. So the other thing that I think often challenges people from the technology side when you think about entrepreneurship is, you sort of look at yourself, and I'm a civil engineer, mechanical engineer, I have all these sort of technical skills. And you tend not to think of the broader skills that are critical in not just in terms of launching a company, but just in terms of being effective in the world. And so this happened to me, this issue came to me actually while I was in graduate school in my last year, and very much kind of struggling over what path I was going to take. Because I knew I sort of was on the track to do research, but I wasn't entirely sure about that. And I ended up going to Stanford's Career Planning and Placement Center and talking to a counselor there. And he gave me homework at the end of the first week. He said, I want you to go back to your office. I want you to write down all the what we would call transferable skills, the things that you're developing in school that aren't part of your coursework, but are valuable on the outside world. So I went back to my desk and I started writing. I said, well, certainly I've had to learn to function in a variety of environments and roles. Teaching skills, teaching other students, mentoring, conceptualizing, counseling, interview skills, public speaking experience, ability to support a position with argumentation and logic, conceiving complex studies, managing complex research, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I wrote this great long list, and I felt great about myself at the end of it. Because one of the things that was funny was I had always been pigeonholing myself as somebody who was a technical person, and that my technical skills were the most important thing. And then in addition to the technical skills, there were things like personal qualities, things that I think we take for granted. You certainly take for granted here at UC Berkeley. And the irony is, here you sit at one of the finest research institutions in the nation, and you've been smart people, so you were smart high school students, and now you've come to an incredible university with all these other smart people, and some of you have gone on to do graduate school, and you find yourself kind of in this cohort of smart people, kind of feeling maybe a little average, maybe even a little pedestrian, not realizing that you're already 3 standard deviations brighter than the rest of the planet. And it's easy in academia to kind of lose sight of what has brought you here and what's special. And as you look at this list, sure, you may not feel like either you or people around you have all these qualities. But what's interesting about this list is that I've gone on to show this list to all sorts of people in the course of researching my book, to talk about how do young people identify career paths that really excite them. And the fact is that when I show somebody this list, and I say there are people like this with all these skills, they get really excited because these skills are the skills that help you lead. These are the skills that help you be effective in the wider world of work. It's not just the differential equations that you're suffering through now. It's a lot of this other stuff that matters. Well, for those of you who go on to a PhD, or even for those of you who are an engineer, it's not just your own self-perceptions of what you do, but how the world looks at you as a techie. So it's particularly for people who go on for a PhD, or even for undergraduates in engineering, when somebody hears that you're an engineer, what sort of image do you think first flashes across their mind? Okay? It's something like this. And you know what? It's not very pretty. But what's really interesting about this mythology about engineers is that, you look at this funny guy, all kind of fun, oddly dressed and sort of nerdy looking, but look at that thought bubble up there in the corner. Very, very smart. Those of you with, a degree from Cal, and those of you who are in engineering from Cal, people will assume you're really smart. People will, in fact, assume that you are a rocket scientist, that you're really, really bright. In fact, they will assume that you're a lot smarter than we know you actually are. So one of the funny things about coming from a school like Cal and being an engineer, for those of you who are engineers, is to address the negative stereotypes about technical people, and it's easy to do. Communicate effectively, dress well when it's appropriate. You can follow all the things that the MBAs do. You can look, there's nothing other than how people dress and how they talk can help anybody discern whether you're an MBA or investment banker versus the nerdiest of engineers. But try not to dispel that one positive stereotype, at least as long as possible. The way that academia teaches us to sort of not just dress down, but sort of be casual. Be casual about courtesy. Those sorts of things matter in the outside world. And those are important sort of housekeeping tips that your professors will probably not be too concerned about. Well, why is it valuable to think like a quote-unquote small e entrepreneur? I think there are a lot of reasons. First of all, the reward system in academia and the real world are very different. And it's good to keep both in mind while you're in school, because the things that you're tested on, the things that you're largely being graded on, revolve around tests, problem sets, all sorts of technical stuff. The stuff that matters in the outside world involve application and practicality. And to be exposed to the outside world now while you're still in school is extremely valuable, not the least of which is that these are the connections you make now are the sort of connections that lead to your first job. And also, there is a tendency in academia not to think simple and not to appreciate simple, creative solutions for their simplicity. In fact, there's almost in a lot of science and engineering programs a greater esteem the more complex the solution is. Another aspect of thinking like an entrepreneur while you're in school is to help you focus on the most important problems. Ask yourself in the course of the courses you're taking and the problems you're solving, what are the most important issues out there? What do I care about? What do you want to say that you had an impact on at the end of the day? And then finally, just from a pragmatic standpoint, the more interaction you have with people off campus while you're on campus, that's going to help you identify potential employers, sponsors, partners, as well as competition. Now is a great environment for you because you have this safe harbor and a time and real encouragement to explore. And the fact that the engineers outnumber the MBAs in this class 4-to-1, I think is a really good sign. It's easy to get caught up in the details of what you're doing and fail to ask, is what I'm doing important? Will it make a difference, and to whom? Just because it's fundable by Office of Naval Research or by NSF doesn't necessarily mean that it matters. And there are also a lot of different ways for you to consider being an entrepreneur. Entrepreneurship is not just starting a company. There is a whole gradation of activities you can take to be entrepreneurial. And here's some things that I have seen other people in academia do, even as undergraduates. So for starters, promulgating your ideas, simply communicating. There's never been a better time and a greater range of avenues by which people can communicate their ideas to the outside world. Being an active citizen, and when I say citizen, what I mean is participating. Organizing things, either here on campus or in your community. Those things take some amount of time, but you'd be surprised at how few people step up to do them. Consulting. One of the funny things, I wrote a recent article on consulting while in school, and I got a lot of really interesting responses from graduate students and undergrads who are already getting some substantial second income consulting on the side. And one of the funny things is there's this process in academia where you sort of come in and you're sort of told how much you don't know. Oh, you've got so long to go. Here I am. I've been in this field for 30 years. I know so much. And it tends to make you feel like you have very little to offer the outside world. But in fact, you've already learned some pretty amazing and powerful things that could be applied today in realistic real-world problems. And there is a consulting club at Haas. I don't know if there's a technical consulting group in School of Engineering, but at Boston University and MIT, there are some graduate students who are earning tens of thousands of dollars a year consulting on the side. Finally, licensing your inventions. For those of you who are undergraduates, UC Berkeley has very little rights to what you invent here. Graduate students, it's very different. For those of you who are graduate students, you may have signed a piece of paper that basically assigns all your inventions to the university. Don't be afraid of that piece of paper. UC Berkeley has a very effective Office of Technology Transfer, one of the better ones in the United States. And if you've got an idea, they can be a very, very powerful resource for you to explore that idea. And of course, the other idea is to explore your ideas in the MBA program and even through programs like the business school, the business plan competition. When I was in graduate school, I met somebody who gave me this really interesting practical tip called the 80-10-10 rule. And it came about because at Stanford we had a advisory panel. And they would be very senior scientists and people in industry who come back to the department and they meet with us. Well, this one person had graduated from Stanford with a PhD in geophysics just 10 years earlier and already had risen very high in Chevron Corporation, senior VP in charge of all exploration research in Southeast Asia. And she came back and met with the graduate students, and at a certain point I somewhat glibly asked her, so what's been your formula for success? And she glibly responded, well, it's the 80-10-10 rule. I said, well, what is that? And she said, well, I'll tell you. She said, 80% of my work week I try to do the most important work for Chevron. I really try to exclude the unimportant sort of peripheral stuff and focus on the critical things. I try to ignore those urgent but unimportant things that eat up. 10% of my work week, she said, I spend solely focused on my own professional development. I close my door, my secretary holds my calls, I read outside my field, I meet people in finance at Chevron, I meet people in finance at Texaco, I meet people on Wall Street. Not because it's part of my assignment at Chevron, but solely focused on my own professional development, 10% of my time. And then she said, the final 10% of my time I spend telling as many people what a good job I'm doing, the 80% of the time I'm actually doing my job. And we all had a chuckle over that, but as I thought about that, I thought, that's not too unreasonable. What it means is in a month, you spend 2 days developing your network and communicating with people, and 2 days focusing on your own personal development. The other thing, for those of you who are doing research either at the undergraduate or graduate level, one of the funny things about commercializing technology is that you already know the most important venture capitalists in the world, bar none. And it's this guy. It turns out that the US government has funded more early stage technology that have gone on to remake the US economy than any of the major VCs you read about in Silicon Valley. And in fact, a lot of these technologies were first identified in a government grant and funded that way for years. The reason I bring this up brings me to my story of Rapt Industries, which is how I'll close. This is the graph of venture capital expenditures up through 2005, and it kind of has averaged at around $20 billion a year of venture funding, largely weighted towards later stage deals. This is the funding of US research and development by the government and private industry. And you'll see that the government these days is funding R&D to the tune of about $100 billion a year. There are some pretty big programs out there that fund early stage companies. And that was the approach that we took with Rapt Industries. The Rapt story, for those of you who don't know, came out of some technology that was developed by Jeff Carr at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Now, at the time, as you might detect in this story, I already was sort of itching for something different to do than being a research scientist at Livermore. So I went around Livermore Lab and fished around for ideas to maybe bring to the UC Berkeley business plan competition. Nice idea. I was doing an evening MBA program at the time. I'd see if there would be some interesting traction to some of the technologies that existed out at Lawrence Livermore Lab. But I met this guy, Jeff Carr, who had an unusual background because he'd worked at IBM Research, and he'd worked on chemical mechanical polishing, and he'd been hired by Lawrence Livermore Lab, which is a very strange move to work on critical issues in polishing optics. And this unusual situation, Lawrence Livermore Lab was building the world's largest laser. And in fact, the world's largest laser will require a tremendous volume of optics manufacturing. And so they had created for themselves a huge optics manufacturing problem. And they had to solve this problem. How do you make large damage-free optics quickly? And Jeff's idea, which he developed while at Lawrence Livermore Lab, was called reactive atom plasma processing. And he had even made a prototype of a tool that ran around on the surface of glass and could precisely etch away the surface and leave behind a damage-free surface. And that was the nucleus of the company. Now, the plot thickens, of course, because as often happens with new technologies, even within a company, you'd be surprised at resistance, internal resistance. Jeff was not one of the Livermore Lab good old boys. He wasn't particularly good at the Livermore politics. And so his prototype was not really well embraced. There was a not invented here syndrome, and Jeff didn't know how to navigate the politics of this large bureaucracy. So as a result, his project was terminated. And when I met him, his prototype, which worked perfectly well, was sitting under a tarp outside a loading dock in one of the laboratories at Livermore. And as I said to you earlier, every setback also represents an opportunity. And this is what happened. We took the technology, and it turns out that Livermore didn't even want to patent the technology or commercialize it, and created Rapt Industries in 2001. We focused on optics manufacturing because that was the origin of the technology, and grown the business into a small but stable and profitable venture, involving the help of a lot of people and a lot of work over the last 5 years. But the interesting thing is if you look at this timeline, it's kind of typical in a lot of ways. Rapt was not, even today, Rapt does not really represent a very good venture investment. And I think one of the concerns I have about MBA programs and in general is that there tends to be this great focus on venture investment and venture capitalists as being the key holders to starting a company. But in fact, most technologies get started on government funding, and many companies get going and get funded on government R&D dollars first, long before they ever get equity investment. So here's Rapt's timeline. I met Jeff in October 2000. We founded Rapt in January of 2001. In April 2001, we won the UC Berkeley Business Plan competition. We thought, oh, all our problems were solved. September, we finally closed our first angel round of investment. And in October, we met with our first potential customer. So we were really, really excited. I mean, it was all coming together. We had money in the bank. We had a great technology. You know, profitability, fame, fortune, IPO was just around the corner. In November, we set up a laboratory and hired our first employee, a UC Berkeley PhD grad. Thank you very much. In March 2nd, we met our second critical customer, and now we're really off to the races. Then we ran out of money. In fact, we ran out of money the same week that the employee number 2, who we'd actively recruited out of Yale, he just finished his PhD, arrived in our office. And the very first thing I got to do when Jude Kelly arrived was tell him that I wouldn't be able to make his payroll that month. And because he was a graduate student, and because Jude, of course, had been living on $1,400 a month for the last 5 years, he wasn't too fazed by that, bless his heart. But we managed to secure a second round of angel investment through friends and family. And finally, by January of 2003, secured our first R&D contract, a Phase 1 SBIR with the Missile Defense Agency. In April, we got our first big R&D contract with the Army Research Lab. And finally, we could get going and breathe. Look at how much time has elapsed. In June of 2003, we hired somebody who actually knew what they were doing, a seasoned VP of engineering with 4 successful startups under his belt. And by November 2003, we got our second big R&D contract, which was commercial. And that was when we could actually start to grow. We hired our first external CEO in April of 2004, and let me tell you, I was gleeful to finally have somebody in the role of CEO who actually knew what they were doing. I learned a lot along the way, most importantly, to always hire people better than yourself, which sometimes is not very difficult. In November of 2004, we had a big falling out, which was actually something that was brewing from the time that the company had started. And my co-founder, Jeff Carr, left the company. Any departure of a founder is a mixed bag. It's an opportunity for the company to move in a new direction, and it also is a loss. But in December 2004, we shipped our first commercial products. Our staff was up to 9. By July 2005, the first CEO had thrown in the towel, and the board was sick of him, so the board hired a second CEO, and our staff was up to 12. In December 2005, our annual sales were $40,000. In June 2006, we relocated to Fremont, California, and we now had set up manufacturing operations in Pennsylvania. We had a staff of 13. By November 2006, commercial revenues were $400,000, and we were still cash flow neutral, even without any of that commercial revenue because of all the R&D funding. And as of now, let's see, as of today, Rapt Industries will cross $1 million in revenue at very healthy margins, and it's a stable business. It's not huge, it's going to grow, but a very exciting transition of a technology that at one point was lying on a loading dock outside of a laboratory at Lawrence Livermore Lab. Well, what's the most single important ingredient for a successful venture? Well, this was a big, sort of a surprise for me, being a technical person. It was about the people. The fact that our hire number 1 and hire number 2 were such resourceful and resilient employees. They were critical to the company. The VP of engineering who we recruited absolutely made the first product line. As I said, people are the vector for new ideas. People are required to take the technology to the next step. And people are at the heart of innovation. Technology in a startup is a necessary but not sufficient condition. So why pursue government funding, or why consider government funding as a mechanism for funding a startup? Well, there's the obvious reason. It's money. It's non-dilutive capital, but probably more importantly, The government is not just a supporter of R&D. The government is the largest customer of just about everything on the planet. It's the Fortune 1 company. And they buy everything from healthcare to software to boots to office furniture. And there's a whole economy just focused on the government as the customer. And the funny thing about the government customer is that they are very interested in buying stuff that they have funded. They have absolutely no concept of sunk costs whatsoever. In fact, the irony is the more they've invested in you, the more they're predisposed to want to buy your products. In the course of working with the government funder in an area of technology, you get a tremendous amount of market and technology and regulatory intelligence. Technologies that are in the cutting edge now are used in the military because the military cares about performance at whatever cost. But many of those performance advantages that the military will now pay a premium for in 10 years' time will be in your automobile and in your computer. And the stuff that the military is funding today is going to be the stuff that you see in commercial application tomorrow. And then finally, from just a strategic standpoint, it's getting money that otherwise might go to other small companies such as yourself in the same area. As I said earlier, most technology opportunities are not attractive VC opportunities, at least not at the outset. And it's not, one of the things that I sometimes get discouraged by is when students sort of feel like, well, if the VCs aren't interested in it, it must not be a good opportunity for me. Not necessarily so at all. Most small companies in the United States are funded without venture capital. Most companies and most people who own those companies become very satisfied with their life and very financially successful. So there are lots of different modes for growing a company besides just the venture capital route. But there are plenty of reasons why you shouldn't choose government funding. It is a long time horizon for money. At least 4 months for chump change and at least 12 months for serious dollars. Now the irony is, as I've watched deals, venture deals unfold, I got to tell you that the timeline from the time the dialogue begins to the time the check actually hits the bank in a venture deal is not too dissimilar. As I said, not all technologies are also not a good match for government funding. So there are plenty of things that are strictly commercial technologies for which the government has no real direct application. But you would be surprised the breadth of what government R&D is funding today, including software. There are, of course, significant business costs of becoming eligible for government funding, ways in which you need to set up your business and set up your accounts. And there's also a perennial problem that the government, while being a very big customer, is not a commercial customer. And there are applications of technology that solely the government cares about and can really steer your company off a path towards true commercial success. And then finally, there's some venture capital companies who really don't like companies funded with lots of government R&D. That they like to see the money come in from them and have that level of control. So for those of you who are ever considering an entrepreneurial venture involving some technology, you should just think about some of these things. When's the right time to think about government funding as an option? Well, all sorts of open source funding options exist. In fact, a lot of the technology you might be working on has already been funded. In some respects, it already has a customer in some government agency. Talking to that customer about what the broader strategic implications for your technology are and where they think it's going can be the first step in developing a market plan. There's lots of professional help you can get, including grant writers and other people who can help you understand how to navigate the complex bureaucracy of the federal government. And also, if you're going to have a company that takes federal dollars, setting up those systems when the company is small is easiest. So, in summary, government funding can be a valuable component of support for a startup, but it's got to make sense. It's got to make sense strategically, and it's hard to do, and hard to do at a large scale without some professional help. Government funding and equity funding is not competitive, but perfect synergy is hard to achieve, and the timescale of the funding is different. And the value of the money is often overestimated, while the value of the market development is often underestimated. And that's a common thing I've seen. 2 useful books I found along my way I'll just throw out. High Tech Startup by John Nesham and A Good Hard Kick in the Ass by Rob Adams, which is often how I've felt these last 5 years. I'm going to close by giving you 10 little pieces of observation, things that I learned along the way. You may have heard these things multiple times from people, but this is what I learned. A great team with a so-so technology will always win out over a poor team with great technology. A new technology has no value if it can't be inserted into a value chain. Making a technology work is easy. Solving the marketing challenge is hard. That's why those people get paid the money they get paid. When it comes to an emerging technology, the government can be the most important investor. Many promising technologies are unfundable by VCs and outside companies. Ironically, you'd think that if the VCs won't touch it, maybe GE Aviation will, but sometimes they can be just as conservative. Rapid prototyping wins the day in any environment. Your first two customers will rewrite your business plan. A seemingly minor technological advance, such as how to mount an optical fiber onto a board, can lead to a $400 million company. It's shocking how simple ideas can have such a high impact. Startups are not much riskier than any other job if you take safeguards. Don't burn your bridges, keep your network alive and intact, and aggressively pursue mentors and advisors. And finally, that sort of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle when applied to startup. You may be curious, wondering if this whole crazy idea that you've got will work or not. Well, the problem is there's no way to know unless you try it. It's not just unknown, but it's unknowable unless you take the attempt at actually trying to commercialize the technology. I'll finally close by saying this is a carbon neutral presentation. I give lectures around the country and offset all my CO2 with TerraPass. And if you're curious about further information, especially the monthly column I write about commercialization and technology oriented towards young scientists and engineers, you can check out my column, sciencecareers.org. And with that, I will close and ask for questions. Thanks very much.